My son-in-law told his golf buddies I was an embarrassment at the country club dinner last spring. He said it loud enough that 2 tables heard him, loud enough that the server who was refilling my water glass looked away so I wouldn't catch her expression of pity. "That's just Eleanor's dad," he said, like I was a stray dog my daughter had dragged in from the parking lot. "He means well. He just doesn't quite fit here." I set down my fork, looked at the centerpiece, and decided right then that I was done being invisible. My name is Walter Grimes, and I'm 67 years old. For the past 14 years, my daughter and her husband have believed I was a retired county road worker living on a pension and Social Security, scraping by in the same 2-story farmhouse I'd owned since 1991. What my daughter Ashley never bothered to ask, and what her husband Derek Marsh certainly never cared to find out, was that the little trucking operation I'd started in a gravel lot off Route 9 back in 2003 had quietly become Grimes Freight Solutions, a regional logistics company operating across 8 southeastern states, hauling agricultural goods, building materials, and cold chain cargo for some of the largest retailers in the country. 41 terminal locations, 612 employees, annual revenue of just over $73 million. I drove a 2006 Chevy pickup with a cracked dashboard and a pine tree air freshener that had long since stopped smelling like anything. I wore the same canvas work jacket I'd worn for 11 years. And I went to that country club dinner because my daughter invited me, because my grandson Cooper was being recognized for his junior soccer achievements, and because I still believed, even after everything, that showing up was what fathers did. I should have seen the warning signs earlier. The first one came about 2 years ago, when Ashley started calling my farm the property in conversations with Derek's mother. Not my home. Not Dad's place. The property, like it was already something to be assessed and divided rather than somewhere a living person had built a life. The farmhouse sat on 62 acres of East Tennessee land that I'd paid off in 2008. Derek's mother, Patricia Marsh, had once cornered me at Thanksgiving to explain, very gently, that rural land values were surging in our county, and that I really ought to be thinking practically about my legacy planning. She said legacy planning the way people say it when they mean they'd like a number attached to your name so they know what you're worth to them. The second sign came when Derek started volunteering his financial advice every time we were in the same room. Derek was 41, a regional sales director for a pharmaceutical company, which meant he traveled constantly, wore expensive shirts with the top button undone, and spoke about money the way people do when they've read too many business books and applied none of them. He made good money. He knew he made good money. He required everyone within earshot to also know he made good money. Every Christmas he found a way to mention his bonus. Every summer he mentioned his company's stock options. When he spoke to me, he used a slower cadence, the way people do with foreign tourists or elderly relatives they're not quite sure still have all their faculties. Ashley had drifted toward Derek's world gradually, the way water finds the lowest point without really deciding to. She wasn't unkind exactly. She remembered my birthday and called on holidays. But somewhere in the decade of her marriage, she had started seeing me through Derek's eyes, the worn jacket, the old truck, the way I ordered the cheapest thing on a menu when we went somewhere nice and asked for tap water without having to be told. She loved me. I believed that. She just didn't see me anymore. Not really. The breaking point was the country club dinner. But it wasn't just what Derek said to his friends. It was what came the week after, when Ashley called me on a Tuesday evening, and I could tell from the careful way she arranged her words that she and Derek had been rehearsing. "Dad, we've been talking. We've been talking about expanding the house. Cooper's getting older. We want a proper guest space. Derek's mother comes every summer now." She paused. "We think it might make sense for you to think about downsizing. The farm is a lot for one person. You're not using all that land." I asked her what she was suggesting. She said Derek had spoken with a real estate attorney, just informally, just to understand the options. She said the 62 acres would appraise significantly, and that if I sold to them at a family rate, I could take the proceeds and find something more manageable. A senior community, or one of those new independent living places that had hiking trails and woodworking classes. She said Derek's mother knew someone on the wait list at Crestview Gardens in Knoxville. She said it was beautiful. She said they had a garden club. I'm 67 years old. I run 4 miles every morning along the ridge behind my house. I rebuilt the engine on my tractor last September by myself. I was being offered a garden club. I told her I'd think about it, and she sounded relieved, like the hard part was over. Derek got on the phone briefly to tell me he thought I was being incredibly reasonable about this, and that the numbers really did make sense from a financial planning perspective. He said financial planning perspective like he was reading it off a slide. I thanked him. I hung up. I sat on my porch for a long time watching the dark come in across the ridge. 3 days later, a letter arrived. Marsh and Grimes Family Estate Transition Agreement, it said at the top, drafted by a firm in Nashville that Derek's company used for corporate contracts. The language was wrapped in warmth, terms of loving family support during life transition, preferred family pricing mechanism for property conveyance, enhanced independent living subsidy from son-in-law, contingent on timely property transfer. They were offering me $240,000 for 62 acres that would have appraised at over $900,000 on the open market. The loving family support contingent on me signing. I had 30 days. I read the letter twice. I read it a third time. Then I walked to my study, unlocked the filing cabinet behind the bookshelf, and pulled out a folder I hadn't opened in years. Inside was the original Articles of Incorporation for Grimes Freight Solutions, filed in 2003, and the financial summary my CFO had emailed me the previous quarter, and a photograph from 2019 of me shaking hands with the CEO of a regional grocery chain at the opening of our new Memphis cold storage terminal, and the Forbes Southeast Business Review article from 2021 that called me the quiet backbone of Appalachian agricultural logistics. I picked up the phone and called my attorney, a woman named Sandra Yee who had handled my business interests for 11 years. Sandra, I said, I need you to do 2 things. First, make sure my personal assets are structured so that no family member can make a legal claim on them without my written consent. I want it airtight. Second, I need to know every business relationship Derek Marsh, his employer Vantage Pharma, and Patricia Marsh have with any company in my freight network. Give me 48 hours, she said. I'll have it in 24. She called back in 19 hours. Walter, she said, you're going to want to sit down for this. Grimes Freight Solutions has an active logistics contract with Vantage Pharma's Southeastern Distribution Division. Cold chain pharmaceutical transport from 3 distribution hubs. Current annual value is $4.8 million. Your company has held that contract for 6 years. Derek Marsh is listed internally as the regional account stakeholder who helped facilitate the original contract negotiations. He had helped bring us that contract 6 years ago, when he'd just joined Vantage Pharma, likely not knowing who the Grimes in Grimes Freight Solutions was. He had never connected it to the man in the canvas work jacket who ordered tap water at dinner. He had been collecting quiet performance credit at his company for years on an account that was, at its foundation, his father-in-law's. What else? I said. Vantage Pharma is currently in the final stages of renewing that contract for another 3 years. The new rate would bring it to approximately $6.1 million annually. Derek's division is counting on that renewal for their Q3 numbers. There's also something else. Patricia Marsh, Derek's mother, is listed as a silent investor in a real estate development partnership called Hillcroft Partners LLC, based out of Nashville. Hillcroft Partners has been quietly acquiring rural land parcels across East Tennessee for the past 18 months. Your 62 acres would fit exactly into a corridor they're trying to assemble. So it wasn't just Derek wanting more space for guest bedrooms. It was the Marsh family wanting my land for a development play, and they were using my daughter's voice to get it. I told Sandra to prepare the contract termination paperwork for the Vantage Pharma account. Non-renewal. She asked if I was certain. That's a $6 million relationship, Walter. I know exactly what it is, I said. I also need you to have my personal property deed transferred immediately into the Walter Grimes Family Trust, structured so that Ashley receives a generous inheritance at the appropriate time, but that no third party can access, claim, or leverage the land in any transaction without trustee approval. And Sandra, I said. Make sure the trust document is dated before I receive that letter. Done, she said. When are you going to tell them? I said I was going to wait for the right moment. Some lessons need the right stage. The right stage turned out to be Ashley and Derek's annual summer gathering, a party they'd hosted for the past 4 years in the backyard of their house in Brentwood. They called it a cookout, but it involved catered food, a string light installation, a custom cocktail station, and a guest list that was really a performance of their social standing. Derek's colleagues from Vantage Pharma, Ashley's friends from the neighborhood association, Patricia Marsh, presiding from a chair near the bar like a retired monarch, and me, invited as an afterthought. Because not inviting your father-in-law while pressuring him to sign over his property would have been too obvious even for them. I drove down in the old Chevy. I wore clean Wranglers and a blue button-down. I brought a peach cobbler I'd made from scratch because that's what my wife Louise had always brought to summer gatherings before she passed, and I wasn't going to stop now. Derek was at the grill when I arrived, spatula in hand, explaining something about his bonus structure to 2 men in polos. He saw me come through the gate and his face did the thing it always did, a quick recalibration, friendly mask sliding into place. Walter, glad you made it. Set that down anywhere. He gestured vaguely toward a folding table. Patricia waved from her chair with 2 fingers. Ashley hugged me and whispered that she was glad I'd come and that she hoped I'd had a chance to look over the documents. I said I had. She looked relieved again. I wondered how many times she'd practiced that relieved look in the mirror. I found Cooper by the inflatable pool and spent 20 minutes talking to him about soccer and his upcoming school year, which was the best part of the evening by some margin. My grandson is 10 years old and has his grandmother's eyes and a laugh that makes you feel like the world isn't entirely broken. I held on to that for a while. The moment came just before 8 o'clock. Derek clinked his glass and gathered everyone near the patio. He had an announcement, he said. He wanted to take a moment to recognize something the family was doing together. He put his arm around Ashley. They'd been going back and forth on this for a while, he said, but they were very excited to share that they'd be expanding their property footprint significantly in the coming months, thanks to a generous decision by his father-in-law. He looked at me across the patio with an expression that was almost respectful, the way people look at an elderly dog that has learned a new trick. Walters agreed to transition his farm property to the family, Derek said. It's the right move for everyone, and we're really grateful. He raised his glass. To Walter, and to smart planning. Glasses went up. 20-some people looked at me, nodding, smiling. Ashley caught my eye, and I could see a flicker of uncertainty there because I hadn't moved, hadn't lifted my glass, hadn't smiled. I said, Derek, I have a question for you. He kept his smile up. Sure, Walter. Do you know who holds the cold chain transport contract for Vantage Pharma's Southeastern Distribution Division? A slight pause. I mean. We use Grimes Freight Solutions for that. Why? The patio got quieter. Do you know who owns Grimes Freight Solutions? Another pause. Longer this time. Across the yard, I watched Patricia Marsh slowly set down her drink. It's a regional company, Walter. I'm not sure what this has to do with. I pulled out my phone. I opened the company management portal and set it on the table beside the peach cobbler so anyone could read it. Terminal network. 41 locations across 8 states. Active workforce. 612 employees. Q2 revenue. 18.4 million. CEO and sole owner. Walter G. Grimes. Derek stared at the screen. He looked up at me. He looked back down. I said, I founded Grimes Freight Solutions in 2003 inches, a gravel lot off Route 9. I've been running it ever since. The contract your division has been taking credit for, the $4.8 million pharmaceutical transport relationship you helped facilitate 6 years ago, the one your bonus has been partially benchmarked against for 3 consecutive years, that contract was with my company. You have been, without knowing it, financially dependent on the father-in-law you've been trying to relocate to Crestview Gardens. Someone near the bar made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Derek said, That's Walter. That's not you can't own that company. I said, I do own that company. Current estimated enterprise value is approximately $61 million. Personal net worth, including real estate holdings across 3 states and liquid investment accounts, is just under 88 million. Patricia Marsh stood up from her chair. Ashley said nothing. She had gone the color of old plaster. I kept my voice even because I'd had months to prepare this. And I hadn't stayed calm through 30 years of building a freight empire by losing my composure at dinner parties. I said, I also want to tell everyone here that I received a legal document 3 weeks ago drafted by a Nashville firm asking me to sign over my 62-acre property to my daughter and son-in-law at 26 cents on the dollar. The document had a 30-day deadline. The letter suggested the proceeds would be more than sufficient for someone in my financial situation. As of 2 weeks ago, that land was transferred into the Walter Grimes Family Trust, which no third party can access, claim, or leverage without my written authorization. So if anyone here was expecting a property acquisition in East Tennessee this season, they should look elsewhere. I turned to Patricia. I said, I also know about Hillcroft Partners LLC. I know about the land corridor in East Tennessee. I know this wasn't about Ashley needing a guest bedroom. Patricia's mouth opened and closed. I looked at Derek. I said, the Vantage Pharma cold chain contract with Grimes Freight Solutions is due for renewal this quarter. As of yesterday, my company has declined to renew. We've offered a transition period of 60 days and a formal introduction to 2 alternative carriers. I imagine that will create some difficulty for your Q3 numbers. Derek said, you can't do that. His voice had gone thin. I said, I did it yesterday morning. Ashley finally found her voice. She said, Dad, I looked at my daughter and I kept my voice gentle because whatever was happening here between Derek and his mother and this land deal, Ashley was still my daughter, and Louise would have wanted me to be gentle. I said, Ashley, I've been watching someone walk through my home talking about my options for 2 years. I've been called a man who just doesn't quite fit here by the man you married, in a room full of people who thought it was a reasonable thing to say. I have never once asked you for anything. I came to every soccer game, every school play, every birthday. I drove 4 hours to be there when Cooper had his tonsils out. I have never missed a moment that mattered. She was crying now. She said she didn't know. About the company. About any of it. I said, I know you didn't know. That's a conversation we're going to have, you and I. Not tonight. But we will. I picked up my peach cobbler from the folding table, said goodnight to Cooper, who had appeared in the patio doorway looking confused and slightly alarmed, and walked back through the gate to my truck. The drive home took 2.5 hours. I stopped once for gas and a coffee, ate the gas station crackers I'd been buying since the 1990s because I genuinely liked them, and thought about Louise and what she would have said about all of it. She would have told me I waited too long. She would have also told me I handled it with more grace than she would have. She would have been right about both things. The calls started the next morning. Derek first, at 7:45. I let it go to voicemail. Then Ashley, at 8:15. Then Derek again. Then Patricia Marsh, from a number I didn't recognize, which told me she'd anticipated I might not pick up from a number I knew. Then Ashley again, and again. And on the 4th call I picked up because she was my daughter and I'd said we would talk. She asked if she could come to the farm. I said yes, Sunday. Come alone. Come for coffee and stay for dinner if you want. She said, what about Derek? I said, Sunday. Come alone. She came at 10 in the morning in the Toyota she drove for errands, not the Lexus. She wore jeans and no jewelry and her hair wasn't done the way it usually was for anything she considered a performance. She looked like the 23-year-old who had called me from her first apartment to tell me the heat wasn't working and she wasn't sure who to call. And I'd driven up and fixed the radiator valve myself and we'd eaten soup out of the pot because she didn't have enough bowls. We sat on the porch. I made coffee. She wrapped her hands around the mug the way Louise used to. She said, Dad, I need you to tell me the truth about something. She asked if I'd hidden the company from her on purpose, or if she'd just never asked. I told her it was both, and neither excuse covered the other. I said, I started the company the year after your mother got sick. I built it while I was taking her to treatments, while I was raising you, while I was keeping this farm. I built it because I needed to feel like I was doing something, making something, while everything else was falling apart. And then it grew into something bigger than I'd planned. And by the time you were grown and gone, I'd gotten used to being two different people. The dad who showed up in the old truck, and the man who ran the company. I didn't want the company to change how people looked at me. I'd seen enough of that in business. I didn't want to see it in my own family. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "But Derek." I said, "Derek is a separate conversation. What I want to know from you first is whether you actually wanted my land for a guest room, or whether Patricia convinced you the property transaction was good for the family, and you let yourself believe it." She looked at the ridge for a long time. She said, "Patricia made it sound like she was helping me help you. She said you were struggling with the upkeep. She said you'd never admit it because of pride. She said it was the responsible thing to do while you still had time to benefit from the equity." I said, "Did you ever ask me if I was struggling?" She said, "No." She said it quietly, looking at the coffee mug. I said, "You know what I've always wanted from you? Not money. Not property decisions. Not estate planning advice from your husband's mother. Just the call on a Tuesday. Just how was your week, Dad? Just you asking." She cried. Not the polished social crying she might have done at the party, but the real kind. The kind that sounds like something tearing. I put my hand over hers and let her. When she settled, she asked what happened with the Vantage contract. I told her the termination was real. I said Derek needed to understand that relationships have weight, and that the weight runs both directions. I said his Q3 was going to be uncomfortable, and that was a consequence of choices, and consequences are teachers when nothing else gets through. She said, "Will you ever reinstate it?" I said, "Not for Derek, but I might build something new with someone who earns it." We sat on that porch until early afternoon. I made sandwiches. She helped without being asked, which is something Louise had always said was the real test of a person, whether they helped without being asked. We talked about Cooper's soccer season and the old oak at the edge of the south field that had finally come down in the winter storms. We talked about Louise, which we hadn't done properly in years, and Ashley cried again when I told her I still talked to her mother sometimes in the mornings on the ridge, that it helped, that I didn't care if that sounded strange. She said it didn't sound strange at all. She said she did it too, sometimes. Derek called twice while she was there. She let both calls go. The weeks that followed were difficult for them in the practical ways I'd anticipated. The Vantage Pharma contract termination sent a shock through Derek's division. He wasn't fired, but he was placed on a performance review that he'd spent 6 years assuming he'd never see. Patricia Marsh made 2 attempts to call me through mutual acquaintances, neither of which I returned. The Hillcroft Partners Land Corridor project stalled without my 62 acres as the connecting piece, which Sandra confirmed through a contact at the county planning office. Ashley came back 4 weeks later, this time with Derek. He looked like a man who had been standing in a room with no windows for a month. He sat at my kitchen table and he didn't ask for anything, didn't make a pitch, didn't speak in the careful cadence he'd always used with me. He just said he'd spent a lot of time thinking about who he thought I was and who I actually was, and that he wasn't sure those two things had ever been real, that the man he'd invented in his head, the one he'd been patronizing for years, was a story he'd told himself, and he was sorry he'd let that story make him mean. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was real, which is rarer. I asked him what he planned to do about the contract situation at his company. He said he was going to be honest with his division head about his miscalculation. He was going to ask for the chance to rebuild relationships with the carriers from scratch, on their terms, not his. He said he didn't expect me to help him. He said he wasn't asking. I told him that was exactly the right instinct. I told him I'd built my company by asking for nothing and delivering everything, and that the only people who ever got ahead in my industry were the ones who understood that trust was earned in hundredths, not given in hundreds. He nodded. He looked at the table. I said, "Derek, I'm not your enemy. I never was. But I'm also not furniture in my own life, and I need you to understand that." He said he did. He said he was starting to. I never offered to restore the Vantage Pharma relationship. Some things need to stay earned, He needed to go find a carrier who'd never heard the name Grimes and build it from scratch, and whatever he built would actually belong to him in a way this one never had. I didn't tell him that, but I think he understood it. Somewhere under everything. On a Sunday in September, 6 weeks after the dinner party, Ashley brought Cooper out to the farm. Just the two of them. Derek stayed home, which was the right call. Cooper spent the morning on the tractor with me, which he did approximately once a year and which never stopped being the best 3 hours of my calendar. He asked 400 questions about how the hydraulics worked and whether I'd ever flipped a tractor and what would happen if you accidentally drove into the creek. I answered all of them. We ate lunch on the porch. Ashley walked the ridge in the afternoon while Cooper and I played cards at the kitchen table, and when she came back, her eyes were quiet in the way that means something has settled. She stood in the kitchen doorway and she said, "Dad, this land is beautiful. I forgot how beautiful it is." I said, "It's yours someday. Not because of any document or plan or transaction, just because you're mine, and this was your mother's, and that's how it works." She said, "I don't want you to think I was just after the land." I said, "I know you weren't. I know Patricia got inside your head, and the story made sense from the angle she gave you. That's how manipulation works. It uses love as a handle. You loved me enough to believe I needed saving, and she used that. That's not your fault. It's something to watch for." She said she was watching. That evening, after Ashley and Cooper had driven back toward Nashville, I sat on the porch in the September dark and listened to the ridge. Somewhere out there, my freight terminals were moving product through the night, refrigerated trucks carrying medicine through the Cumberland Plateau, flatbeds loaded with building materials heading toward the Gulf Coast. 612 people whose paychecks came from something I'd started in a gravel lot because I didn't know how else to hold myself together while my wife was sick. I'd built something real. I'd built it quietly, in Wrangler jeans and steel-toed boots, without ever needing anyone to see it. And the strange mercy of that was that when it finally mattered, when it finally needed to be seen, it was too large to argue with. My phone buzzed. A text from Ashley. "Thank you for today." Cooper talked about the tractor the whole drive home. "Also, I called you last Tuesday just to call. Did you get it?" I texted back that I had. I said it was the best call of the week. She sent a heart, then a tractor emoji, then nothing else. I put the phone in my pocket. I looked at the stars over the ridge. The same stars Louise and I had watched from this porch for 31 years, and I thought about what it means to build a life that holds its shape even when the people you love stop looking at it. The shape doesn't change. The weight doesn't change. The only thing that changes is who finally decides to look. If you're watching this, I want you to know one thing. The person who respects you least right now is probably holding a story about who you are that they built without asking you a single question. That story is not you. Don't let it be. And don't wait too long to correct it. I waited 14 years. Most of that time, I was fine. But those last two, when the letters started and the realtors came, and my daughter used the word property, those 2 years cost something I won't get back. Speak up before the silence becomes the story. That's the only thing I'd do differently. Subscribe and tell me where you're from. And remember, the quietest people in the room are sometimes the ones who built it.